Hey everybody, this is the first of our eModules for SPCE 302 rework. So the idea of these is we're doing the disability boot camps in class, which is good because I want to show you specific things. This gives you an opportunity to get some lecture and some context on your text reading, which we are not. We are certainly not skipping. We are just using our class time resources differently. Per your guys' requests from course evals and just communicating with you over the semesters that I've taught this class. So ideally I would like these to be no more than about 20 minutes, but today might be a little bit different because some of the issues and concepts with classroom behavior are very important, especially in context of special education. With that being said, we will not dilly-dally, as it were. So chapter 8 is this idea of classroom behavior. Now, we already seen that one of our major disability categories is emotional and behavioral disabilities, and so that in and of itself shows that we're going to need to have some sort of specialized knowledge when dealing with student disabilities and student behavior. So we can start with some basic context. What is behavior? Well, even going back to Darwin and to Skinner, behavior is basically a response to the environment. I'm going back to Darwin because he took that one step further and said that evolution is really just a behavior as a long-term or genetic, foundational level behavior change or an adaptation to new circumstances or to an environment, a change in the environment. So, and then Skinner went on to say that behavior basically was determined by your environment. If you guys have seen the Skinner box, that you could make, animals, you could train animals and even people to, act or perform a certain way, to get certain outcomes. And that's actually something that we use, this idea of operant conditioning, something that we use even in task completion and task analysis. So we use behavior well beyond behavior. We use it academically as well. So when we're talking about operationalizing definitions of behavior, this is important because you're going to have a kid at some point that's going to be out of control, and you're going to need to be able to properly articulate what specifically is happening to the proper people who you'd be talking to, whether that be an administrator, a guidance counselor, a special educator, someone on the RTI team, or otherwise. When we're talking about behaviors, we need to be extremely specific. We can't just say, things like, oh, he doesn't care, or he's not trying, has the bad attitude. We need to specifically define specific actions as well as durations and locations so that we can start to develop patterns. The key to behavior management, and especially for students with disabilities, is understanding triggers and causes of behaviors and then trying to work and build self-management strategies. So having more information about specific behavior issues over, oh, well, so-and-so is just not here with it today. I mean, with it is not necessarily easy to operationally define. We could say that they put their head down, they will refuse to engage when called on. It could be that they will not, they refuse to engage with classmates. It could be, a specific hostile act towards a classmate. You'd be pushing them, hitting them, scratching, whatever, taking their things. It could be any of those specific things. Okay, so the idea is that we want to make sure that we have specific information. And as far as the specific information, we want to know things like, okay, what specifically is happening? Where is happening? What's the context as far as what was happening before specific behaviors? What happens after specific behaviors as far as what is going to be the outcome or the consequence of the behavior? So we can also use this idea of being specific to students because it makes it because we can basically create a streamlined or a platform of expectations through specific terminology. If people understand when and where and how things are specifically either okay or not okay, it takes away some of the gray area where it's like You know, I better not see your lips move. Okay, for example, uh, as a teacher, you'd be like, I better not see your lips move, and there's probably some little precocious child that reminds me of myself a little bit that would, take their lips and they would, you can't see this, it's a video, but they would move their lips and they'd be like, "Rah, rah, rah, rah," and they would make faces and they would do all sorts of, my lips, or I'm not talking. What the teacher said is, we don't want you to talk. And what the student took is, oh, I understand that you don't want me to talk, but the way that you framed it wasn't necessarily a clear expectation of behavior. So I'm going to do something that's going to, make you mad. Like it's going to go against you and push you and test your limit because you didn't clearly define my expectations and my boundaries. Us clearly defining boundaries, it makes it easier when it comes to judgment calls as well. So anyways, when we have kids that have a specific behavior issues, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to be logging a lot of information on behavioral data. So here we have some examples. I'll just go through these relatively quickly. Event recording is sometimes called the frequency recording. It's the number of times a particular behavior occurs. So let's say you do a 30-minute observation. Your event recording would just be a tally mark. 3 times, 4 times, 8 times, whatever, however many it is. Duration recording, how long the behavior lasts. So you could use a watch, you could use your phone. If it starts, you could just start the timer, or you can count. If it's 35 seconds, 43 seconds, put the start time and the stop time. So like 10:03 and 38 seconds, and it goes until 10:04 and 12 seconds. That's going to be good information that we can use later. Interval recording. Basically, you set up periods, like, okay, basketball has 4 quarters, football's got 4 quarters. Baseball has 9 innings. Those are all those scheduled intervals. So we would have in a 30-minute interval, or in a 30-minute observation, we can have a certain amount of intervals. We could be 1-minute intervals, so we'd be 30 of them. It could be 5-minute intervals, and there'd be 6 of them. Basically, if the child exhibits a specific behavior in that period of time, we just shade in the box. Excuse me. So we shade in the box. If they don't exhibit the behavior, we leave the box blank. And then basically, at the end, we just tally everything up and see how many times or how many periods or intervals the child exhibited the behavior, and then we do a percent basically out of that. And that's good because this tells us if behaviors are clumped up or if they're consistent over a period of time. And then this time sampling, specific point of time, you can basically pick specific or points in time at random, and you can determine whether or not the behavior is being displayed. So consider it like a random sampling, okay? I think time sampling makes it a little confusing because that's a little bit like duration recording. But think of it as a random sampling. The behavior will just have some preset times when they go in, and you can write them down on a piece of paper to keep it valid. And then once you reach that time, you check, and you just spot check yes or no. And so you can say, I've determined 10 predetermined times during the observation, and when I looked, they did it, 7 out of the 10 times, whatever. Okay, so one other form we're going to do is something called ABC coding, and this is definitely something you're going to be doing anytime you're trying to get a behavior plan going for one of your students to log behavior. So basically, it's a before, during, and after. Consider it that way. Antecedent are what comes before, and then consequence, which is usually what follows a behavior. One thing with ABC coding is that the behavior is always going to be consistent. There's never going to be any variation in the behavior, because if we're trying to monitor a behavior, we want that to be, consistent, and we want that to be the thing that we're looking at, so that we're making sure that we're looking at that and maybe not at something else. So the behavior will always be consistent. What comes before the behavior and what comes after the behavior is what's going to determine what the pattern is. So there's usually 2 things in practice that this turns out to. It's either that something is triggering the behavior, in which case we will notice a pattern in the antecedent where, it's basically trigger followed by behavior followed by necessarily wanted and unwanted, but maybe not necessarily avoidable given the antecedent consequences. So the consequences maybe the child's not necessarily so worried about. It's just that the antecedent triggers the behavior, and then what happens after may not be so consequential because it's how we respond to the behavior. The second thing that could happen is that the behavior is done in order to achieve a desired consequence. And usually this is done as an avoidance strategy. Let's say, for example, somebody doesn't like math or isn't good at math. So they find a way to get in trouble at recess because math is right after recess. So they're in the principal's office a lot, or they're sick a lot from lunch, or so they find, ways to get themselves removed so that they don't have to attend. They get the desired outcome or consequence of they get removed so they don't have to attend the class that they're struggling with. So, like I said, those are the two ways. Basically, the one is the antecedent triggers the behavior, and then the second way is that the behavior is leading to a desired consequence. That's basically the two things that we're going to see pattern-wise. But once again, this goes back to operationalizing definitions and being specific. We want to be as specific as possible with information regarding both what's happening before, during, and after, using specific action and descriptive words, and being very specific as much as we can. Okay, so we're going to go through these relatively quickly because you take whole entire classes on classroom management, so I'll try and really keep it close to special education. But basically the idea of formal classroom management is to maintain classroom expectations while still fostering a positive environment that students know that they can grow and make mistakes and not necessarily be afraid of doing such things. I'm supposed to be a comfortable environment, but yet it has to be an understood and a standards-based and a well-maintained standard of environment. Okay, so this idea of token economies, this works very well, especially for students with both intellectual disabilities and autism, because sometimes the abstract ideas of, I guess, like hard work is its own reward, and what's like the long-term impact of being good, right? This is a nice tangible way for students to monitor and regulate their own behavior. What the problem with token economies is that if used too much, or if overused, you turn into basically a pay-for-play type of thing, where it's like, you jump through the hoop and I give you the treat. It's not necessarily avoidable, especially at the start. That's kind of how you get people moving, because you move from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation, which we'll talk about in Chapter 10. The idea of externally attributing motivating to something kids want, like a piece of candy or time on the computer, and then transitioning the benefits that they're getting from the academic gain to try and build the intrinsic motivation. I want to be good at school because I enjoy learning, and I know that if I learn, I can gain skills that can give me a better quality of life. That's a pretty high intrinsic motivating factor. But it's not always easy for kids to get to that point when they can, kids can barely see 5 minutes in front of their face, let alone think about what's going to happen when they're like older, right? Now some kids can, obviously, but some kids can't. So the token system is just it's a reinforcer of positive behavior, and it's also an indicator of negative or undesired behavior. So usually when you do token economies, I actually recommend having two separate systems for token economies. You need to have a good or a positive behavior currency or token. The thing is when kids do things that are good, we don't want to mitigate things or negate good things that students do when we punish them. Many times we take away and we put all of our tokens into one big bowl, and you take away as much as you add in. So the problem is, it's like, good job, Timmy, you did a great job, you really, for 45 minutes, on track, really just doing great, and you earned, a fuzzy or something like that. So here's this little black fuzzy sitting in Timmy's pouch, and he knows that he earned that black fuzzy because he was really good on Thursday or whatever. And then something happens, and he's like, okay, you did something and you give me a fuzzy. So you go in and you take that black fuzzy back, and it's like, well, I did all that for nothing. And it's not a motivator, okay? But how do we still then consistently um, how do we consistently reinforce the punishment or the negative reinforcement aspect? We get a secondary currency. They can still be fuzzies, coins, mini economy dollars, whatever it is, but they need to be slightly different. And this is good for progressive discipline as well. I'm sure you've heard of progressive discipline in your methods classes. The idea of we have increasing tiers of severity of punishment. So everyone can get 3 fuzzies a day or 5 fuzzies a week, and that's in their special behavior fuzzies, okay? If they do something that's a violation of a rule or something, they have to give up a behavior fuzzy. They understand that those behavior fuzzies are theirs only if they maintain the rules. So they're not losing something good that they did. Those fuzzies are neutral. Those fuzzies are being rented or leased to the student, on contingent on their good behavior. If they do not provide or meet those expectations, they get that taken away. But they're not necessarily having a previously good moment mitigated or taken away either. So definitely the two currency system, you'd never want to take away a good reinforcer because it's something, you don't want to take away a reward that's earned, but you can put up a secondary system. Then you can take away, because then, if a kid's acting up more than a couple times in a day or a week, they deserve to get some kind of punishment. So, that can help you too, because it's like, okay, let me see your fuzzy pouch. Oh, you only have 2 left. That means that, when you hand out 3 fuzzies, when you give up your 3rd fuzzy, then this happens, or it's easier for you to keep track of it too. So, this idea of public, okay, it's almost like reverse shaming, but this is really good too. If you can get like a good guy award where you can post good things, because like, I don't know, if when you were little kids, you may have been used to seeing people's names on the board or something like behavior charts, or more or less the people that didn't do good stuck out more than the people that did do good. If you can make the people that do things well and do things right stick out, that's going to be more of a motivator, because people want good attention as opposed to bad attention, and that's something that people might be more interested in working forward. So like I said, using negative consequences and using progressive discipline, we have to understand that it's good to maintain rules and to enforce rules, and we do have to call on our own power base as an authority figure at times to maintain order, but at the same time, we have to understand that it's a sensitive relationship between a child wanting to expand. A child wanting to expand their boundaries is natural for a kid to want to do, but also understanding that they need to live and operate within a certain constraint of parameters of acceptable behavior in society. But understand that too much, it can just be seen as it's good to use your authoritarian power base at times, but if you rely on it too much, what you do is you lose some of the more facilitative and some of the more camaraderie-based power bases that you can utilize as a teacher, and it basically loses the reinforcer ability, because if the kid's if a kid becomes used to or conditioned to the negative responses, then well, what's the next level? We've kind of played all of our cards already, and it still hasn't necessarily gotten the desired results that we want. So there's graduated timeouts as well. This is, it's going to be effective at times to remove kids, especially from kids who are starting to escalate their behavior. So basically you can either have contingent observation, which is, you can't be in the reading circle, but you can sit in this chair because you can't stop messing with Susie. So if you can't stop messing with them, you can sit in this chair, but you can still listen to the book because we want you to listen to the book. got the exclusionary timeout where it's like, okay, you can't, we're doing a science experiment. Sorry, if you squirted the dish soap at, you know, that's not the proper, Tammy, and that's not the proper use of that, and you lost your privilege to participate in the experiment. That'd be an exclusionary timeout. And then seclusionary timeout would be basically like, okay, it could be a student who's having a STEM kind of a meltdown that might need to go to a sensory type of a place, or it could just be a student you've done a violation to the point where you need to go see the principal, see the counselor, otherwise not be in the room. Understand that there is a time and a place for each of those specific things, and there's also not times and not places for these as well. There's times to not use both of these sorts of things. So, okay. So we can go through some of these relatively quickly because this is kind of standard. Generalizing behavior, which is basically taking standards and expectations that you have and putting them into other sorts of situations or circumstances. De-escalation is always good. Okay, we can talk about positive behavior supports. Positive behavior supports is kind of a model that focuses on the positive reinforcement as opposed to traditional punishment, because they consider punishment, like we were talking about, the overuse of punishment is kind of a breaking down of the ego and the esteem. So basically, we want to, instead of taking the traditional model of trying to remediate bad behavior, we want to really try and focus on praising and modeling the good behavior, and then coming up with more proactive ways to try and help students who may be having behavior issues. If there's something that we can do that makes that we can change the environment, maybe the environment is a barrier to access, maybe the specific interactions that the student's having with other students might be being a barrier to their better access or better behavior. Is there something we can do? Is there something the other students can do? Is there something that we, as the school, can do? Okay, so the last two things we're going to talk about is the functional behavioral assessment, and then the behavior intervention plan. This is old, but so the FBA and the BIP. So if you have a kid who is having some sort of behavior issues, disrupting class, causing a major beyond normal type of disruption in an extended period of time, you would talk to them, a special educator, maybe the RTI people, and be like, hey, we're having such and such an issue, and they may recommend a functional behavior assessment. So this is basically to try and determine root causes of behavior. So they'll go through and they'll do the different observation techniques that we talked about earlier, and try and assess any patterns and see if it's maybe a trigger, or if it's maybe a desired outcome, or what's particularly causing the behavior. This isn't necessarily, you may be keeping a lot of data for this, but basically we keep the data, and then you send it off to like the special education team, and they kind of meet. And you can be involved in the meetings as well, but usually like the LEA kind of does a lot of the crunching on that. And then what comes out of it is this behavior intervention plan, which is something that's a little more something that you're going to be doing. So the behavior intervention plan are specific measures that are going to be done in order to remediate a specific behavior. The idea is that we want to follow this plan to a T. We need to make sure that we're consistently applying and enforcing all of the terms, because the key to behavior modification is consistency across environments. That goes back to this idea of generalization that we touched on a little bit before. So the more consistently we have to it can't be like a mom versus dad power struggle where I know that mom won't cave in but dad will because he's got is a softie or whatever. We know that regardless of the situation, these are my expectations. It becomes more second rate it becomes second nature the more routine that it becomes. And the idea is, once we establish the routine, we've established a routine for acceptable behavior. So very on a very subconscious level, molded, this child's core value and like attitude and disposition set, which is, good, uh, simply because that we've provided them an environment that consistently, pushes or tries to foster that, and then also extinguishes destructive or counterproductive behaviors as well. So, anyways, that's the quick syrup version of the chapter 8 on behavior management. I specifically want you to take the idea of operational definitions of behavior, because when you're collecting data, you will collect data, okay, for your kids. You can actually properly articulate what's happening, so you need to make sure to use those specific words and descriptive words. We learned about the different recording types. We also learned about ABC coding, which this is, something critical that we're going to be doing, especially in the FBA process, all of these things. And then we talked a little bit about token systems, the idea of the two currency system, so that you will not take away from previous positives or previous achievements, but then, at the end of the week or the end of the day, they can deposit their behavior, tokens into their positive, because they'd surplus, they were extra good or whatever. And then the idea of being careful and judicious with negatives, the grades of timeouts, and then basically the PBS, positive behavior supports, and then the FBA and the BIP. See, that was quite a bit. So probably a little longer than I would really like to have these in the future, but that's okay. We got through things. So there's going to be 2 questions that I'm going to have you answer, and you can go ahead and answer those and put them in the Dropbox for this assignment. And yeah, just continue on as normal. Excellent. So thanks for viewing, and I'll see you next chapter.